pragmatic, but eventually I found that there is actually a certain logic for the kinds of arguments about Islam that have been developed over the years that kind of needed to be put together and defended. There are a number of several contexts for this work that I would like to mention at the beginning. That is the motivations for actually doing it. One of the first kind of motivations I have had to do with the Arab Uprisings that began in 2011 or late 2010 and continue and will probably continue with us for many years to come. And even though those uprisings don't have much to do with Islam, really, but they did actually reveal a big problem that we have in terms of communication and the capacity to communicate across societies. And we see that in places, especially like Egypt and Tunisia, where kind of, in spite of all efforts, kind of the communications between the Islamists and non-Islamists sort of broke down, or there were a great deal of misunderstandings. That showed that we don't really have enough of a capacity to discuss ideologies, so to speak, across political divides in Arab countries, especially when it comes to religion. And it seemed to me one of the biggest problems we have is the kind of the forgetfulness that ideas and ideologies do not determine people. They are produced by people, and it is really the people themselves and the individuals that we want to be concerned about. Why did someone come to believe in an ideology or another kind of, and what do they want out of that kind of belief? Right? There is an issue, not that how that belief kind of determines them. The problems that we see in places like Egypt and Tunisia, and also elsewhere in the Arab world, is actually the inversion of that way of thinking, right? Which I thought led to disasters, namely the belief that ideas come first, that and people are kind of created by them, and a lot of the motivations for the book is to actually show that things are the other way around, that kind of give back to the individual human, so to speak, their agency, investigate what is it that they want out of one ideology or another. Right? And that kind of goes back to the question as why do we have Muslims? Why do they continue to exist? And this is sort of, if you want to go to Sigmund Freud in 1939, when he wrote Moses and Monotheism, that was actually his question as well, although his analysis is very different from mine. But Freud's question was similar, is that why do we still have Jews around in the modern world? Even though it's an ancient, for Freud, that is an retrograde ideology, but he wanted to at least understand why basically old ideas continue to live in the modern world. I do not, of course, follow psychoanalytic model. That's not really my thing, but basically I asked the same question ultimately from a sociological point of view about Islam. The other context for this book has to do with the kind of public engagement with the Islam debate since September 11, 2001, which kind of taught me how to talk to academics and non-academics at the same time. Because after September 11, especially in the West, kind of the question of Islamic mobilization, Islamic militancy, or what have you, kind of came to the fore. And not just in academic circles, but also in all kinds of public forums that I participated in. And so one is sort of a skill that I tried to develop. I'm not sure I succeeded very well in that, is to try to present kind of a work on Islam that actually do bridge kind of these various communities of knowledge, kind of the educated public as well as kind of the academic. The third context for that really comes with my frustration, right? Which comes from the first point I mentioned, with kind of debates about Islam being really kind of determined by secular agendas, so to speak, in the West as well as in the Arab world in particular. and that is basically the many kind of liberal, secular thinkers or educated individuals kind of spent a lot of time trying to figure out how do we make Islam democratic? How do we make Islam compatible with human rights? How do we make Islam compatible with homosexuality, for example? Whatever, I mean, all these kind of modern kind of concerns. And I thought it is one thing that was really problematic with all these kinds of agendas is that they are agendas of secular people, so to speak, right? And they do not actually ask religious people why they are religious, so to speak. So I thought that one missing part of those liberal debates basically is kind of an attempt to understand religiosity from the point of view of the religious person. And the trick here is that personally, I am not a religious person. So I need to put that up front so that you know where I come from. But in spite of that, my understanding, basically, I thought that my obligation as a sociologist basically is to try to figure out what is it, right, that actually makes some person, not whether religion can be made liberal, for that matter, but rather whether what is it that a large number of our people actually are kind of moving in the direction of religiosity, and what is it that they want out of that, so to speak. And only when we establish that are we able to actually communicate with those people, so to speak, and they're able to communicate with us, vice versa. There was also kind of a need to, I think, since the Iranian Revolution in particular, 40 years ago, there is a large body of literature on the sociology of Islam that has emerged, that has different quality to it than the literature about Islam that we had before the Iran Revolution. And so we had a tradition of thinking that had evolved that I thought need to be somewhat summarized, put together in a way that is, so to speak, presentable, and so that we can actually learn something about all that kind of heritage of scholarship. Finally, the final context, so to speak, or rather the motivation for kind of writing this book was an attempt to kind of understand Islam not as a special case, and not to essentialize Islam, right? But rather to see Islam as part of the larger story of conservative thought in the modern world, right? So how do, for example, Islamic movements in the Muslim world compare to, say, a Christian social democracy in Europe? And it is actually a longer history of organization, so to speak. What does it have to do with liberation theology, for example, in Latin America or what have you? So the idea here is that kind of often the study of Islam is presented or encouraged to be presented as something of a special case or a special problem. And there are elements, of course, of the Islamic modern experience that can be treated in that way. But I thought more importantly, basically, if we have a global modernity and a reaction, and a global reaction to modernity, so to speak, then we can expect similarities in that reaction across various societies. So how does the global conservatism in general live on in a modern world, and what does the Islamic experience in particular teach us about that global experience in particular? So there are a number of fundamental motivational factors that lie behind this work, and whether I succeeded or not is really up to other people to judge. But I tried my best. Now, let me just outline some of the main theoretical propositions, basically, that emerged out of those motivations. One of them is what is Islam? and that question, of course, I began to think about it when I heard a populist, anti-Muslim, right-wing politician in the Netherlands, whose name is Geert Wilders, who hates Muslims and doesn't want Muslim migrants in the Netherlands, saying in an interview, I have no problem with Muslims, I have a problem with Islam. And when I heard that, I thought, how could that be, actually? Because from a sociological point of view, Islam is what Muslims do. That is what Islam is. Of course, it's not from a theological point of view, but if you want to really take the point of view of the believer seriously, right, then basically you have kind of to propose that Islam is what that believer actually had in their head. It is, and that is what the Islam as a living religion is, to speak. That is anything, any ideology that is alive at any point in time. Basically, its meaning is given to us by the people who believe in it, to speak out. And that is the sociological point of view that kind of is appropriate. So basically taking kind of emphasizing the pragmatics, so to speak, of religion. And that was where the idea of pragmatics kind of they came into the picture, namely how is religion put into use in the Muslim problem by people who believe in it, just like Marxism, just like nationalism, just like liberalism, just like any other ideology, that when it is put into practice by someone who believes in it, the meaning of that ideology kind of depends on the kind of meaning that kind of is kind of given to it by a person who actually is attracted to that ideology precisely because of the meaning that they derive out of it. And that related to that is a second kind of theoretical proposition, which has to do with this idea of the life world, so to speak, right, as kind of the practices, the sum total of practices that provide a kind of religiosity with a constant kind of license on life, so to speak, continue to live across generations, across centuries, in vastly different social environments around the world, so to speak, right. So the question is, how does religion kind of live? And I thought it was important when we think about life was actually to separate it into kind of compartments or into rooms, so to speak, where kind of that pragmatic meaning is established. One of them has to do with daily practices or social movements, and that ultimately leads to political or practices of political participation. There's also life world in the terms of debating ideas, the public philosophy. So not kind of Islam as kind of debated among the ulama necessarily, but rather when Islam kind of enters the public sphere as a public philosophy, what form do these kind of ideas give, and how do they persuade millions, so to speak, of them? And finally, there's a third kind of fundamental theoretical proposition that you probably may detect throughout the book. It has to do with the idea of harmony and conflict. Right? And that is an old kind of concern. I kind of this kind of encountered one in my first book, Social Origin of Islam, for more than 20 years ago, when I looked at the 7th century, so the point of origins. And one of the things I thought that I discovered in writing the book was how the success of Islam in the 7th century in becoming a pervasive kind of social and cultural ideology had to do with the fact not that it introduced harmony into society, quite the opposite. In fact, social conflict continued to be on. The class conflict continues on. Tribal warfare continued. So Islam actually back then did not solve any problem. The one thing it did, though, it organized conflicts. And I think most successful ideologies do that to the extent that they are successful. That is, of course, unless you resolve all social differentiation that we have, right, which no one has ever done, right, the next best thing you do is organize conflict. And so that conflict becomes predictable, so that the reference points basically are agreed on, and also so that each social segment comes to regard religion as it intimately speaking to it, right? So that the peasants, for example, begin to think of Islam as their own religion that speaks to the realities of their life. But so do the merchants, so do the urbanites, so do kind of the working classes. And that basically goes to back to the idea that you see at the end of the book, Heteroglossia, which I borrowed from Miguel Bakhtin, namely kind of the way by which kind of the variety of social voices kind of inhabit the same narrative space, and each of which imagine kind of the predominant ideology of society to be actually its own ideology, so to speak, and therefore kind of has a chance to think of its own position basically as being universal, as opposed to be particular to the class or social position of the person who believes in it. So the question here is that kind of Islam, right, is like any other religion, is not harmonious, nor does it introduce or create social harmony, right? Nor does it resolve any conflict. Right? It survives precisely because it makes conflict kind of regular, kind of subject to common kind of rules of arbitration, and also forces all kind of conflict partners to kind of use Islam as a regulatory point of view. A good example of that is Hurub al-Ridda, for example, in the first century of Islam, right, where basically 30 years before they happened in the same territory, right, but under a different name, right, under Musaylima, for example. And Hurub al-Ridda basically were anti-Islamic, so to speak, right? And they happened before Islam was established. 30 years later, when Islam actually entered those territories and became the dominant ideology, you continued to have another war kind of emerged after that. But essentially, it was the Khawarij movement, right? And the Khawarij were kind of people who were in the same territories, right, or operate in the same territories where Hurub al-Ridda happened, but they spoke in the name of Islam, not in the name of their tribe anymore. Right? So whereas before Islam, tribal warfare happened in the name of the tribe. After Islam, they happened in the name of Islam. There are exceptions, of course, to that story. But if you look at class conflict, for example, in Islamic history, you often kind of see kind of those kinds of conflicts, kind of or social conflicts rather, being propagated once Islam is established in the name of Islam itself, rather than in the name of a specific social group or segment. So those are kind of the fundamental kind of theoretical kind of propositions in the book that you see throughout. There are a number of detailed kind of discussions that I want to just very briefly point to. I cannot summarize the book right now. But out of this perspective, one thing that for me kind of emerged as kind of very important to keep in mind, especially when we think about Muslim Islamic social movements, like Al-Ikhwan, just to pick the most kind of the clearest example, right? You see a great deal of experimentation. Right? And one thing about the Islamic social movements that I think, or I thought was important to kind of stress, is that they are not finished products, to the extent that they don't have state power yet. But rather they go through stages. They learn, they adjust, not necessarily for the better, but basically political activism kind of becomes a way of discovering the limits of the possible. And for any of us, anyone who is an activist, so to speak, eventually in any using any ideology, I think eventually comes to learn something new from their kind of activism that they did not know before. And the Islamic social movements are no exception. So you can see, for example, in the history of any specific social movement, Islamic social movement, a great deal of experimentation that is happening. Rather than, I thought it was a mistake to think of them as kind of completely formed, so to speak, and determined, and kind of as finished products. They are not. That's bigger, especially when kind of they don't tied to a kind of power apparatus. But the one thing they do, and that is from the point of view of kind of the believers in them or the participants, is that they provide kind of the participants with a feeling of capacity for action, a feeling of participation. And that's in the absence of democracy, in the absence of at least predictable democratic channels. I thought that was one thing that Islamic social movements actually did accomplish, namely give otherwise apolitical individuals, individuals who kind of did not understand the state or did not care about it, or it was not open to them, with a feeling that they could act in their own neighborhood, so to speak, and out of that kind of feeling of local action, get a sense of agency and empowerment and sense of self-worth in a world that otherwise kind of did not pay attention to their kind of the small individual kind of being, to speak of. And that is something that I thought is comparable to the kind of feeling that one gets from democratic participation, but perhaps for the believer more valued, because democratic participation, if we understand democratic participation as voting, and then going home, in Islamic social movement, you have actually continuing kind of action on the world in the absence of democracy. So feeling of participation in the absence of democracy is one of the main, I think, accomplishments or the main attractions of Islamic social movement to the people who joined them and who were otherwise apolitical, but at least they were given a capacity to participate with the aid of an ideology that was already familiar to them in some way. So the ideological material that kind of gave people that kind of capacity was already kind of existent in society. Now the question of public philosophy, and I don't want to spend too much time that basically it is this is a long kind of discussion ultimately, and I tried to simplify kind of the positions. Because the idea is that, well, you have actually Islam in the modern world does not consist simply of social movements, or whether Ikhwan or jihadism or what have you, but far bigger than those movements is the kind of the audience of the readership of kind of Islamic kind of the ethical and behavioral manuals, so to speak of, and that is where Islamic public philosophy, so to speak, becomes important. What is it actually that tell the ordinary people? There were two non-exclusive or non-mutually exclusive kind of main schools of thought: hermeneutic Islam versus instrumental Islam. Hermeneutics basically it is often the term gets used a lot lately in ways that I thought were imprecise. But part of my aim before is to actually use the term in a way that actually gave it kind of a coherent meaning, so to speak, where basically what attracted a lot of individuals to the hermeneutic perspective is kind of the emphasis on knowledge, the kind of the idea of the more philosophical idea of having a kind of an infinite source, right? Which is God, to speak for the believer, right? Something that is infinite, that is eternal, that is not limited by time and space, giving instructions to a human, an entity that is finite in time and space and is mortal. And the old kind of equation, if it's hermeneutic, is how does the infinite kind of relate to the finite? Can the finite kind of understand or comprehend the infinite? The hermeneutic answer is no. You cannot do that. That is, in fact, if you do that, diminishes the idea of God, so to speak. So one conclusion of the hermeneutic school is that kind of any understanding of divine message is situational rather than certain, to speak. And so a great deal of the interpretive kind of capacity that is given to the individual faithful, but it was kind of a capacity that is actually not kind of infinite, but rather finite, given the finite nature of humanity itself. And not so in the instrumental kind of variety, which basically says Islam is a solution, namely that it is an instrument to solve problems that we have right now. And in the instrumental school course, you have a great deal of authoritarianism because there is a sense that indeed we can know what God is saying, right, with certainty. Obviously, God wants us something to do, and it is what we are understanding at the moment. And we know a lot, of course, of political kind of experiments that were guided essentially. I think with the historical kind of, if you have the historical kind of perspective on Islam, I thought shows that this is a very modern idea, applying the Sharia, تطبيق الشريعة. That is because, as far as I see it, not a single state in Islamic history ever applied the Sharia or thought that its role was to apply the Sharia. And that actually applies to the Rashidun period as well. So if you read Fazl al-Rahman, for example, one thing he kind of is curious about is that the Khalif Umar did not typically cite the Quran or the Hadith whenever he decided anything. He just kind of decided on the basis of what he thought was intuitively the right thing to do, so to speak. And of course, for Fazl al-Rahman, that meant that actually suggested that the early kind of believers had a totalistic kind of understanding of Islam, so they don't actually need to cite anything. And basically they can, so they did not actually apply the Sharia consciously, they just understood what is right, the right thing to do, as political and social actors. That may well be the case, although what we know is what we know, which is that they actually did not feel a need to actually cite those sources, unlike later generations. But one thing that you see beginning with the 10th century of Islamic experience is the rise of the Siyasa manual, or lots of books with Siyasa at their title, and typically the Siyasa manuals were kind of written in order to cover stuff that did not exist in the Sharia, which is the rules of government, so to speak, how to govern a population, so to speak, how to run a state. That's not in the Sharia. And those kind of sources are Machiavellian in nature, to speak, although they were written 5 centuries before Machiavelli. But we were more original than Machiavelli. In fact, in the Indian subcontinent, it's that tradition is even earlier, so to speak, the Siyasa manual, even before kind of Islam, so to speak. So historically, actually, it is the Sharia was never actually understood as something that a state, including an Islamic state, should apply. This becomes a modern kind of issue, precisely because basically for many ordinary Muslims who actually don't necessarily understand what in the Sharia is that they're looking for systems that are not corrupt, so to speak, and are clean. And they understand the Sharia to actually be the namesake of that lack of corruption, which is a common kind of social thing. But they don't actually understand the Sharia as some kind of in details, and it is not something that is can be translated into laws. This is something that Iran under Khomeini actually discovered before anyone else, when they were trying to actually kind of link the Sharia to law directly. And after 8 years of experiments with that kind of model, Khomeini gave the government a license to just disregard the Sharia and just pass whatever law it found to be appropriate. And that was because precisely that was the one kind of attempt to actually impose the Sharia, and it failed, to speak of. So the Sharia has nothing to do with the law as we understand it today. I think there's a great deal of misunderstanding about that, and this is something that I thought we should kind of really clarify very well. Whereas, from my perspective, historically the Sharia was sort of a quasi-anarchist system, so to speak, in the sense it had multiple authorities behind it, not a single authority. It could house contradictions, actually, in the sense that different fatwas could contradict each other, and that was perfectly acceptable. And the validity of any fatwa depended on its sociology rather than on its legal validity. That is, it depended on how many people were willing to believe in it, rather than on whether it conformed to kind of an established kind of legal principle. So I think the kind of foray into the Islamic kind of historical experience, namely the kinds of flexibility that made Islam into a kind of a global system, one sees basically one sees that through the evolution of the Sharia itself over several centuries as a kind of a system from below, so to speak, right? That corresponded to kind of the needs of faithful invested in different social environments and different world regions and different time periods as well, but not as a coherent kind of body of thought, to speak, right? And not a body that was defined by the state or kind of passed by state legislation. That never happened in Islamic history. So the globality basically of Islam resided precisely basically in the kind of the diversity of possible interpretive kind of approaches to its fundamental source material. If we did not have kind of that flexibility and diversity, Islam would not have had a life world and would not have survived. Nothing, in fact, that is kind of as rigid as kind of we expect a kind of modern kind of autonomous government to be a kind of can survive in a global kind of world. So finally, there is a lot of things that could be actually said more in a more organized way than I've been trying to. But the final kind of point at the end has to do with with the Arab Uprisings, which I began with, and I would like to end at that point, namely before 2011. Most literature that we had about the politics in the Muslim world, mobilization in the Muslim world, assumed that the only ideology that was capable of mobilizing people in large numbers was religion. And that was a perspective that emerged basically from the period, those 30 years between the Iran Revolution and 2011. And where basically we see that the kind of secular forces became weaker, religious forces became stronger everywhere in the Muslim world, more visible. And it seemed also that the sociological literature went along with that, assumed that basically if we ever have a revolution, if we ever have a large scale social mobilization, it was bound to have a religious character to it. 2011, we were surprised that was not the case. And 2019 as well, the next kind of iteration of mass movements in the world, we also don't see actually much in the way of religion, so to speak, determining kind of being central to the demands of any of those large-scale mobilization. So that does not mean that people became less religious. That is, but rather it kind of verified kind of the status of Islam as a reserve discourse. That is a discourse that is there in the culture, so to speak, right? But it comes into use as one needs to, right? And not as a habit, so to speak. So basically, that is where I ended up with the idea of what is this thing that we call the reserve discourse, right? And Islam basically, I think, function in that way, in the sense that it is one of those experimental discourses that were available, that are pulled out from its hibernation to address problems that other ideologies seem to be actually failing in kind of addressing, or not addressing kind of quietly. And there are a number actually of kind of fundamental, so to speak, issues, common issues that are tackled by this discourse, including social solidarity in the one world, including questions of participation and the ethics that make that participation possible, whether that is before democracy, participation in communal life, the questions of legitimation, what makes a political system or social system appear to be legitimate, the question of social justice, which continues to be with us in a big way, and the question, of course, would be kind of what is the ideology that is best suited to guarantee kind of the attainment of the desired kind of social justice, and the question of general civic ethics, namely how do we talk to each other, how do we relate to each other, how do we respect each other, and so on and so forth. So a cluster of general issues that can be tackled by any ideology ultimately, and the question is which ideology appears to be kind of more successful in addressing those issues given kind of the conditions of time that we have. Islam, of course, has kind of the advantage of not having encountered any kind of anti-clerical revolution in the Islamic world, so to speak. Unlike, for example, in France, just to take an example of that. So it is there in the culture, in the background, often. Sometimes comes to the foreground, right? When other kind of attempts fail, but when you have like great social movements like the Arab Uprisings and its aftermath, it retreats again in the background because the social experiment is being, in addressing all these issues, is being carried out by a new sets of mind, so to speak. So I think in some, basically, I would like to kind of end there and basically remind that of the beginning point, which is that basically one way to actually address the problem of Islamic consciousness in our society really kind of requires us to kind of try to understand religiosity, the deep ground of religiosity and religious commitment from a religious point of view. And the religious point of view, of course, is not uniform. It is varied, just like any other kind of frame of mind, so to speak. But at least we can try to schematize it and kind of try to kind of understand the kind of religiosity not as a product of evil intention, if of course that is what we're inclined to think, and that includes jihadism ultimately, right? That one also has to understand, and our obligation as a kind of scholars thing, and this is not simply to just take a political position and be satisfied with it, like many people have done, especially in Egypt and Tunisia, right? But actually primarily, right, to understand the kind of world in which we live, including the world inhabited by people who are different from us. Okay, and I will stop here. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mohammed. Really, it is a great synthesis of your book, and I like the introduction, which you started by motivation. Why did you write this book? And of course, it's part of your trajectory when I see your other book, and really this book for me, culmination of until now of a kind of maturity of your thought on the sociology of Islam. And I think your book really, it's a major breakthrough in sociology of religion. Again, it's how you bring the Islam into the heart of understanding of globalization process. So I would give the floor now to Professor Louay Safi. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Sari. And I would like to congratulate you, Mohammed, for writing this book. It is engaging, thought-provoking, and profound in many of its analysis. And I'm sure you have spent a lot of time thinking about those issues. The interesting thing is that, I come to the opposite conclusion that I heard from you now. Of course, in your book is more nuanced, but now you said clearly that you don't think that Islam as a religion contributed anything for the resilience of Islam itself. So let me share with you how first of all, let me say that I do like the fact that you looked at Islam from the word, from the life word.
Sorry, did you hear everything? Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Continue,
Okay.
Louay. Just if you raise a little bit, your voice will be better.
Let me maybe bring my laptop closer. How about now? Maybe I can raise the. Is it clear now?
Yeah.
Okay. So I do like the approach very much because the approach is so sophisticated, trying to look at Islam as a worldview, Islam as a life world, which is to say as a both socio-cultural and socio-historical reality or phenomena, if you will, which is definitely when you approach any subject from that angle, you are going to come up with a lot of depth in discussing various aspects. I could see it clearly throughout your book. And I'm sure that many would find it an important source, particularly in the West, to have a closer understanding or deeper understanding of Islam. They might come also, like me, to the opposite conclusion, which is that's the nature of what we do. We write something and then it gains, life of its own. That's the human creation always. We can't control what we write. So I think really you have done an excellent job in showing why Islam has been resilient, which is the main question in your work, of course, that lent itself to many other questions and answers. So you have shown that the reason Islam, maybe the main reason, as I understand it, of course, I would like to hear your response to my own understanding that will reach the discussion. So I understand that the resilience of Islam, based on your writing, lies in its ability to stay close to society, civil society, and to shun any elitism that we find elsewhere, in any religious or secular system. I do also like the fact that you did not really try to take a systematic approach, a system, let's say, based approach to understanding Islam, which has make your intervention quite rich in terms of looking at the nuances within society and within the social movement that Islam lent itself to. But of course, the downside of that is then the patterns and the lines become a bit blurred. So you don't see really any structure very clearly. Although you have tried to show some structures, but these were very microcosm type of organization, not not in the light of, let's say, what is not talking about socio-historical movement. Islam as socio-historical movement doesn't appear very clearly in your work, although it's not completely absent. It is there, but there's you don't see it very clearly. The picture continues to be blurred. And I guess because of that also, there are many elements that lie in the pre-modern times that have impact on our times that are not clear there. Yeah, I know that you have picked a number of writings that have to do, and events and instances that have to do with the pre-modern Islam. But I guess there it was a bit thin on analysis as opposed to the modern. And I guess nobody can ask any writer to be really thick on everything. So I do appreciate the fact that you stuck with looking at Islam as a life word in modern times, which is by itself a great task. Now, in terms of the life word, I think there is an issue also here for me, at least. I don't see that the life word that you try to depict is differentiated enough to provide the reader with enough understanding of the dynamic itself. What is the dynamic here? It seems to me that the dynamic is a bit missing. And so we end up with life word that is really partial. Again, this is not like trying to say you have done, you have not done a great work. What I'm saying, because of the nature of your study and focusing on the modern and Islam in particular, then the worldview, the life word that have a great impact on the Islam as a worldview in modern time are absent. For example, we don't see in your work the impact of Western intervention on what's going on in the Muslim society today. Of course, it is in the background. Definitely anyone who is familiar with what is going on can fill a bit of the gap there. But still, I think there is much to be said here to understand the life word of Islam in modern times. I would say also, for the same reason, the life word of Islam in the pre-modern is a very blur, is a very thin on material and on analysis. And I'm saying that because I believe the way to understand today Islam or even Christianity, both as a religious, socio-historical movement and as a political movement with its ramification or its manifestation in liberalism and neoliberalism and imperialism, then you have to look at it really as a socio-political movement. You can't understand liberalism today without looking at it as a socio-political movement, and the same thing with Islam. Okay, now let me move on to talk about, I think I heard from you saying here today in your presentation, and I could see it also in more nuanced way in your work, and a number of assumptions. I mean, one assumption is that there is, the secular sort of is opposed to the religious, as if there is no connection between the secular and the religious. I don't think we can understand. I don't think that we can talk about Western secularism without noticing that secularism was born within Reformed Christianity. It was Reformed Christianity that gave that space we call secular to the West. And you can't talk about secular aspect of Islamic life historically without bringing religion as a cause for creating that room for what we call secular. For example, if you talk about Islam, we can understand why non-Muslims were able to live an autonomous, ethical, religious life within Muslim society. I say autonomous, not just free. Autonomous, meaning they could really believe and practice what they believe, even it was a very sort of provocative to the Muslims. And we have instances where Muslim jurists prevented Muslims from imposing their ethics on the Christians because the Christians have their different religious system. Is that a manifestation of the secular? To great extent, to great extent. So then, I mean, this dichotomy between secular and religious, I think is problematic, and I see it as problematic. Probably you lived in the United States for a long time. I did the same thing. I think like the founding fathers of the United States were religious as much as they were secular. So that's why I think this concept has to be problematized a bit more so that we can make a deeper sense of it. The same thing about this, the use of instrumental rationality. I found it a bit problematic in the work because you know very well this category was developed by Weber. The instrumental rational is a category, and we know that the opposite or the other half of it is the value instrumental. But then when I look at your work, you seem to be able to separate both completely with confidence, as if some individual or movement have instrumental, rational, strategy, this will mean that they would have no value at all. I mean, they are not guided by value, only by trying to achieve the goal. And I think I could really sense it as you were talking about a number of Islamic movements. I do agree with you that some of them are really instrumental through and through, in the sense that they have not taken the time to look deeply on the meaning of their faith, or they don't care much about the public values that are part and parcel of Islam. So that is something to be looked and analyzed. But you yourself gave examples of movements. I mean, I was your portrayal of the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, was very interesting and very really even positive. I would say it looked very positive to me because what you said, that, I mean, this movement was able to continue and to prosper because it grounded itself in society and not in the state. And of course, we know that is the heritage of early period of Islam and how Islam evolved historically. Okay, so that's one assumption. There's a third assumption. I think I could see it, but let me move on to another point. Let me then talk about something you just said about the infinite and the finite, and how the finite cannot really be able to understand the infinite, which I agree with you, but not in total. Yes, the finite and the infinite are two completely different categories. But then, particularly in monotheism, in the monotheistic traditions, this relation has been clarified in a very interesting way, because all of these, religions, all the Abrahamic traditions, all of them have maintained, at least at the level of rational idealism, have maintained that the human being as a finite being relate to the infinite spiritually. In other words, the divine created the human in his image, as the Bible would say, and the Quran would say that God, Allah, created the human beings through his spirit. They have something of his spirit. And of course, his spirit, as we must understand it, has to do with what? With being the peaceful, the just, the living, the loving, all those Asma Allah al-Husna, those beautiful name of God, which really we see them also in a very minute and finite form in the human being. We could see people who are compassionate, who are just, who are knowledgeable, because these are the qualities of the divine. And so as such, there's a connection really. Of course, the infinite will continue to be a mystery, because human rationality can never wrap itself around the divine, because no way for the finite to wrap himself or herself around the infinite. But then there is sort of intuition. We can intuitively feel the divine in the human spirit. Let me move on to talk about, how much time do I have? Sorry, I don't want to really take much.
For 7 minutes?
7 minutes. Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Let me talk a bit also, before I move to talking about social movement, public philosophy, and partial and the global order. And I found those really titles fascinating. They are part of the puzzle. You try to really to fill a lot of that puzzle. And I found it very informative. Let me talk about Sharia, of course, because you concluded with talking about Sharia. And you said the Sharia has never been applied. And I agree with you again, but this is really, has to do with how do we understand Sharia? Because as you know, scholars in the past differentiated between Sharia as universal principles and Sharia as rituals, as day-to-day practices and part of regulating the transactions between a human being. But as universal principle, Sharia is really made of value system. So it's a value system. Why do you think, these Bedouin Arabs who come from a very harsh environment never thought when they moved to Syria and to Persia and to Egypt, never thought to say, okay, who are these Christians? These are nobody. Let us get rid of them. Okay, force them into Islam. That never happened. Syria remained for 3 centuries a Christian majority. It was really, if you go into details and look at what happened, you find that there has been a dialogue, there have been a process, there have been a number of reasons why those societies embraced Islam, including the fact that they were closer to their view of the divine and of religiosity than the Byzantine, version of Islam, which became later on the Western Church, the Roman Church, as opposed to the Eastern Church. Most of the followers of the Eastern Church in Syria became Muslims, and they empowered Islam because really without their own previous understanding and ability to analyze complex text and analyze and have being grounded in literature, then probably the Quran and its sciences would have never evolved to the level that later was used to organize the first globalism that we are aware of, which is the Islamic globalism. I guess this is the second globalism, and I thought in your chapter on globalism was a lot to be learned for us today to try to deal with the challenge of global governance, because you brought here. I'm going to jump 2 chapters because really that's where it's relevant here. We talked about partial control, meaning the state as a central organizing authority was limited and did not try to intervene with local communities as how to organize themselves, which is really based, I would argue, if you go and read the Constitution of Medina or the Sahifatul Medina, you find similar approach taken by the Prophet on a small, in a small geography. So he never tried to write a constitution that says, the the religion of Medina, which by the way called Medina Munawwara, not Islamic Medina. Probably some of the Islamists today would call it that as such, if they would be the one who have captured it. It was really a constitution that really emphasized individual rights, was universal in its reach. So it didn't say, well, the Jews are secondary community. It says that they are like, they have all the obligations and responsibility of everybody else. Like they have to defend this city like Muslims, and they have really to prevent injustice in collaboration with everyone in the Medina. So we could see here, why Sharia at the level of society really informed the organization of the polity or the life, the life world of Islam. It's not by accident that the entire globe, from China to west to the west, the Arab West, what we call today the Arab West, Morocco and then Algeria itself, the whole region was managed in a way that created sort of a replicated model that you could see it all over the place. And of course, probably you are familiar with the work of Marshall Hudson. He has an excellent work trying to explain what really, what was the nature of Islamic globalism. And he, of course, talked about the metropolitan as an important nexus in trying to bring some uniformity to the entire, life world, let's use the same word, while leaving places outside of those metropolitan areas to enjoy their own specificities. But the culture, the high culture was of all people, whether they were Christian, Muslims, or Hindus, was very much synthesized, in a way that created stability. Okay. So we can't explain a principle like pluralism or religious freedom or equality of humanity, that all humans are equal, without reference to Islam. And then, that's why I'm surprised to say Islam had no impact at all. It was like just society, on its own grew the way it did. Let me then conclude by saying a few words about social movement and public philosophy. I'm not going to do justice to your work. And I don't want really my listeners to think that I have a negative views of what you have discussed. I really see the benefit of it. It is a very useful, very important, very enlightening. I'm just surprised by the conclusions. That's it. So let us look at this social movement. Of course, you differentiate between two main strands of that movement, the emergency movement and the normal crisis movement. I think it's very useful. It's very useful, very helpful, very descriptive, and as an analytical tool is very, very also helpful. But I guess really this has also to be seen as a dialectical relationship. Because, it's not surprising to see someone who starts in an emergency movement and end up in the normal crisis movement or normal movement. And it's not really an accident to see someone start with instrumental rationality and then adopts what you call the hermeneutical really worldview or way of episteme, the way of analyzing reality. And in fact, we could see that even in historical Islam. Remember that this hermeneutics started in probably the 4th century of Islam. It started in the writings of Al-Jassas, who tried to base the entire Sharia on the concept of maslaha, which has been picked up later by other scholars. And Al-Izz bin Abd al-Salam has written a complete book. One of the most sophisticated work in the history of Islam is called Al-Qawa'id al-Kubra, and trying to show that the entire Sharia is based on two principles, can be reduced eventually to two principles which were always there in the background. جلب المصالح ودرء المفاسد, the affirmation of human interest, public and private, and repulsing
at the same time. Sorry. Yes. So at the same time, you're saying that we're finding ourselves with the sort of contradictory elements in your book, where you explain that Sharia is also like practiced by the ulama, so it comes back to the four schools of Sunni law, while you said that it's not a law, but at the same time it is practical, it's not a social organization. So there are elements that are really contradictory for me, that would necessitate a sort of explanation from you. The third and final point is exactly in page 88, where you mention the concept of tradition by Tal al-Asad. You say that Tal al-Asad, and I'm quoting you, Tal al-Asad defines tradition, namely as a discursive tradition to the past, governed by the requirements of engagement with a defined set of foundational text. And you're saying that this definition is unsatisfactory because it's focusing on the past. But the issue is Tal al-Asad is not saying that. He's saying the past, but he's saying also the past and the future. I mean, this is the point. The point is that for him, tradition is not localized in the past. Tradition is a lived tradition, where the past is connected to the practices of the present and to aspirations to the future. Now, I don't know what you meant exactly. Maybe you can clarify, but definitely there is a misrepresentation of his definition there. Or maybe you're just agreeing. For some reason, you said that it's unsatisfactory. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So, any question? Danny? Please. In the mic. You need to use the mic. Yeah.
Thank you a lot. Thank you for joining us today. I only have one question regarding the definition of social movement. In chapter 1, where
can you hear him, Hamad?
No, I can't hear him.
I mean, it's very.
Yeah. So I go ahead and I will repeat it. Go ahead, your question, please.
So the question is related to the definition of the social movement. So you take the case in part 1 and you start talking about Islamic movements, but you never give a brief what social movements are. So for example, when you tackle analogies or give examples of the Muslim Brotherhood or, for example, Hezbollah, you take it for granted that they are like a social movement but with a political agenda per se. But for example, we have in Lebanon, on part of Hezbollah, the same social movement such as the movement of Sayyid Mohammed Bamyeh, minus the political project. So where does such project stand, for example?
Okay. Did you hear or I repeat?
You could repeat that because
yeah. So you said you in your chapter 1. I mean, you didn't really define what is a social movement. So talking about Muslim Brotherhood as a social movement and then Hezbollah as a social movement. So how would you distinguish between these two models from Sayyid Hassan Fadlallah, which is really it's a social without political agenda, while Hezbollah and Ikhwan, they have political agenda, if you like. So what is your definition of social movement?
okay, good.
Yeah, and other than Fadlallah, I mean, it's just he gave an example. Yeah. So, any question? Sophie, do you have something to say? Yeah.
point that Islam is presented like as tradition that needs to, open up and modernize. And that's one is in the idea of European Islam, Islam as a religion is like more looked at as an individualized practice. And then the third one, there's a distinction between what is to be a good Muslim and like the bad kind of Muslim, as I put it that way. So like in terms of looking at Islam as a life one, which I think you argue out that it would, help understand Islam, and in relation with the kind of perceptions or how Islam is debated in the public spheres of some of the notable European countries, for example. So like, how would studying Islam as a life was probably giving insights into this kind of debates and how like you understand issues to do with integration, issues to do with like discrimination, issues to do with a lot of issues to do with like Islamophobia and that kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. So basically, Hamad, there is a hidden criticism in what Sophie she said. She said, look, you show that Islam as a practice today is not the traditionalist, it's modernized. Islam take different shape in the public sphere, and then you talk about Islam as a life words, as a practice in everyday life, if you like. If we take the basic hermeneutic definition of life world. So how would you, for instance, Sophie didn't say that, but I understood that why you didn't take a clear sociological cases where you show us how Islam is practiced in if you like, more, if you concise yourself, you didn't take an example, a small example, and where you show how Islam is perceived, practiced, lived over time, for instance, or over geography. Yeah, Mizuki?
Thank you so much for this lecture and speaking. I want to start with humanism related with Islam. So you talk about the resilience of Islam and how it's a diversity of the population, but at the same time, you also talk about the religion and connection to Islam. Then I'm kind of wondering how it runs that Islam can be also humanism, but also I don't even, for me, it's not really clear why Muslims get really stick with Islamic tradition and Islamic norm, while Islamic norm can also be humanism. So, is there any way that Muslims can find the approach towards humanism if Islam is connected to humanism? It makes sense. So how do you take words and make it sense to understand that?
So if Mizuki is asking Muhammad, if Islam is really embody humanism, so why do we need the Islam? We normatively, morally, I can stem my morality from a humanism. Why do we need for a religion? Yeah, something like that. So let us stop here, and maybe we take another round later on. So I give you the floor, please.
Okay, thank you, Sari, and thank you, Dr. Louay, and thanks to the audience. This is too much so I will try my best. These are excellent comments, really show a great deal of engagement. A lot of what was said I actually agree with, and many other points actually they help me think more about the issue. Let me just say a few words about secularism, because that's actually is a crucial point. I do not mean to, even though the discussion sometimes may have appeared to actually sketch out the stark differences between the two kind of mindsets, I don't actually regard the secular and the religious to be actually that separate. It depends on what kind of historical context and what kind of situation we are dealing with. We know that when it comes to actually the question of colonialism, for example, and anti-colonialism, these are often these are combined kind of perspectives. Ismail Ragil Farouqi, for example, was both religious and secular at the same time, right? A nationalist, anti-secular, and committed to Islam. The Ataturk, in fact, earlier on, before he became was also in the service of the Ottoman Empire. The difference between the secular and the religious, I think, becomes more pronounced when actually there is a clear difference in terms of what they can accomplish. And that is not always clear, but if you look at Turkey, for example, one of the main factors for that establishes Turkish secularism, basically as kind of a real, clear alternative to religion, was the Ataturk's success in fending off Western imperialism versus the incapacity of the Sultan and kind of the old religious establishments in Istanbul to do the same thing. And only at that point does the difference between the two become clear. There's a record of success. But even in Turkey, actually, then the situation, like 30 years later, become blurred again, and kind of Islam become integrated into as an ingredient in Turkish nationalism. And toward the end of the 20th century, the mix becomes even more clear, right? So the secular and the religious are not, I don't mean to imply they are as kind of clearly separate from each other. I think they become separate depending on a certain situation, but even when they become separate, that is not kind of an eternal condition. The reference to the US is well taken. In fact, I completely kind of agree with it, basically in terms of the founding fathers of the US were actually not completely secular and not completely religious. But one formula they came up with is, I think, I forgot his name, one who was American Civil Religion, where they use the word God, the creator, basically, in a kind of non-Christian way, but they continue to kind of maintain kind of that idea. Monotheism, I actually agree with the idea of monotheism and connect with monotheism and globalism. In fact, there's a course I teach every now and then on globalization, and I begin that course with a discussion of the role of monotheism as kind of an early, as part of the experiments, kind of early experiments in creating kind of a global interconnected society. So that's well taken, and I agree with it. One thing about instrumental rationality versus value rationality, I think I should have clarified that I am not using those terms in the Weberian sense. I agree with that, namely that for me, the instrumentalists, in fact, are. It's not as though kind of they have no value rationality. Quite the opposite. That these are actually combined, basically, in kind of both systems of thought that I have kind of inclined, kind of addressed. The thing about the question of reserve discourse coming to the fore, Again, that is also part of the idea that kind of in complex social environments, different kind of ideological framework kind of may coexist, not just in the social fabric, but even in the same mind sometimes. And we have a lot of examples of that. And it seems to me that what makes a kind of one kind of frame of mind or one ideology come to the fore is, again, its demonstrated capacity for success. So in a way, that is pragmatic kind of approach. So Islam becomes more appealing when it shows that it could actually succeed as kind of as a social movement, as a revolution, whereas kind of other kind of social movement, other revolutions, adopting different ideologies have not succeeded. So it is kind of so the whatever kind of when we have an ideological mix in society or even the same mind, I think that the whatever comes to the fore is the one that seemed to actually to be very clearly leading to success versus another kind of ideological framework not actually leading to success, and that can change. One thing, though, about the experimental nature of Islamic social movement that I should highlight again is that I am not trying to idealize anybody, including the Ikhwan. To me, for example, the Ikhwan as a global kind of experiment there is similarity in style of action. And program of penetrating society, so to speak, Islamizing society. But there are vast differences in terms, basically, if you want to kind of be normative about it, there's really no comparison between, even though Rashid al-Nushi and Hassan Turabi, their writings are similar in terms of commitment to pluralism, human rights, gender, all that. The political practice is very different, basically, and the political practice basically seems to be determined by the method of arriving at power, whether you arrive at power through elections and through popular consent, or whether you arrive through a military coup. And that seems to me to be actually a decisive kind of factor in how what happens basically to the mind, depending on what kind of route kind of leads to success or failure. Let me just say a few words about the other set of questions. I'm intrigued, actually. I'm thankful to the question about Muslims saying Islam is not what we do. Which I didn't think actually about it that way, but it seems to me to verify the point I made, because when a pious person says that Islam is not what I do, what that person seems to be doing is that he or she is constructing Islam as an ideal, not as a reality, as kind of an object of a project, as a striving to be attained. So it's still the same thing. You say it is not what I do, right? That means one of two things: either that I'm now a Muslim, and I don't want to be, that's one, or that I am sincerely Muslim and I want to be there, but there is a high ideal and I'm striving to do it. So that basically seems to be also a kind of part of the equation that we're dealing with. One is thinking about how to become a Muslim, right? And it is something that they want to do, and they know, and they are telling you that they're not there yet, so that's really part of the same kind of idea. The question about Talal Asad and his definition of tradition, this is something I am actually very close to my heart, because for many years I've been writing about tradition, which has turned out to be an internal project. It's not finished yet. But one way to think about tradition, and a familiar way, in fact, to think about tradition, is that tradition is uncontested immediacy. So it is something that is done by the force of habit. Because everyone around me is doing it, I do it, so to speak, and I don't actually have to think about it. So in that sense, basically, this way of thinking about tradition as something that is familiar. It does not require engagement with any ancient text, but it is already there in front of me, and people are doing it, and I'm doing the same thing that they are doing. This immediacy, this organic nature, to speak, of doing what one is already doing, for me is tradition, to speak. Now, people who want to justify what they are doing and begin to read books from the past in order to figure out the meaning of what they are doing, they are a step away from tradition. Ackerman and Pescatori, in fact, they call that objectification of Islam. So what they do is that Islam becomes an object of knowledge, and you relate to it from a distance. You need to discover it. You need to learn about it. Its meaning is no longer as obvious, basically, as it used to be, or as it is supposed to be. And that is and that can also be considered to be really part of traditionalism, but it is not really, does not cover the full range of the behaviors that we try to capture in the term of tradition, so to speak. Sociologically speaking, it is often the case that when we do things reflexively by force of habit, because they are familiar, that tends to be regarded as tradition. When in modernity, when you need to actually figure out what is it that you are doing, the meaning of it, and investigate all sources, when nervous energy basically attached to the quest as well, then actually that's a different form basically of relating to the tradition, but it is not the only form to speak that. There is the question of universal humanism. That is good, I think, and the question is good. The question is, how do we get there, right? So the question is, if as it was said about nationalism, basically in the 19th century, I think Garibaldi in Italy said something about that I am cosmopolitan, right? But I believe in Italian nationalism. Why? Well, because the cosmopolis is not really available to me. So basically, nationalism is or a nationalist commitment is sort of an apprenticeship through which one learns about something more universal. Right? So in a way, universal humanism could be regarded as something that we strive for. We don't actually know what that means. We have not really seen it, or we don't actually see the principles of it. It is not something as defined as a religion, for example, or as a nation. But if Islam is another term for universal humanism, which is, by the way, something that Muhammad Shahrur says, then a commitment to Islam becomes some sort of apprenticeship, some kind of practice through which one learns about larger loyalties, and eventually we may get there. So I think that's a good question, really good there. And we don't necessarily need to be Muslims to get there. But for some people, actually, you need to practice loyalty to larger principles as something that is tangible enough, right? And then out of that, you learn something more about commitment to universal humanity or what have you. And by the way, I don't think I agree with Sari. I don't think Shahrur is consistent or has a method. That is not why I'm including him. In fact, I don't think that the Hermeneutics are equally consistent necessarily in their system of thought. But I'm kind of including various people who probably do not belong together when you think about the rigor, when you think about the method. But if you think about the intention, then you can group them together. So I don't, and I don't think any of those people are people I necessarily 100% agree with. But they seem to have a similar intention, so to speak. And this is the range. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me polish that up.
Yeah, so I'm sorry for that. Okay.
No, that's okay. That's fine. And yeah.
Did you finish your? Yeah.
مستنى بس يجوا الناس ولا؟
Sorry. Did you finish your discussion?
Yeah, there's just one point actually. The point remaining about social movements. Defining social movements. Social movement for me is an organized kind of social body that it may be connected to public intellectuals or publicly known personalities like Fadlallah. Fadlallah is not a social movement himself, right? He is a kind of a known kind of religious personality who has a following, but the movement is something that is, when we talk about Hezbollah or Hamas or the Ikhwan as movement, we are talking about social organizations actually that are conscious of themselves as organizations, to speak at. And that is very different from, say, public intellectuals who kind of sit there, issue fatwas or write books and have following, right? But having a social following is not the same as having an organization. Basically, that has a dynamic of movement and a dynamic of action and a hierarchy and so on.
Thank you. Any other questions, thoughts? No? Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
A life world of choice and kind of ethics and everything that would be about choice, kind of how doctrine would guide that. So I was wondering about why you chose this framework of ethics, especially as I think thinking about ethics in our daily lives is more of a kind of a metaphor now together that we have. And for example, things like ritual ceremonies, kind of attending the more aligned with the framework.
Did you hear her question? No. Okay, so if I will pretend that I understood the question, but I mean, what her question is, why did you choose the approach of Lifeworlds? I mean, it's so fragmented. Okay, so and ethics. Okay, participatory ethics and things like that. Okay. Any other thought? Any other question? Yeah, Foster. Yeah. Yeah. No, it's better. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Bamyeh. Thank you so much for the book. I was wondering, in your opinion, in the book you write that successful Islamic movements often cut across class, and you mentioned in your opening remarks that these movements are conservative movements. So I was wondering if you thought that there could be successful Islamic movements that incorporated leftist politics and kind of class analysis into the movement, if that would be possible. And then kind of piggybacking on that, I was wondering like how the concept of life worlds can apply to political movements outside of religions. Like, can secular movements succeed in the same way that religious movements can? Or is there something intrinsically special about religious movements that allows them to succeed maybe in the modern world?
Okay. Last question? No. Okay. So you have two questions and you can wrap up. And then I will ask Louay if you want to say any things, and then we will end this fantastic talks. Go ahead, Hamad.
Okay, thank you again. The question of life worlds, basically, it seems to appeal to me because I'm talking about, or I'd like to talk about social things as kind of as alive, right? As having dynamism, as capable of change, as social movements as learning processes, right? Confronting obstacles, not having full knowledge of the environment in which they are operating, right? Growing in a way that are unexpected or failing because they misunderstand the situation in which they live. Right? That is life. That's what we call life, basically, namely. And often, basically, in sociological and political science analysis, often the analysis kind of is oriented to the structure of things. So to something that is finished, something that has a clear kind of contour. So there are things that can be actually talked about that way, maybe bureaucracy or state structures or so on. Right? But the people we are talking about don't necessarily have that kind of power. They don't control that much, actually. And they tend to be experimental in nature. And that includes their thought systems. That is part of kind of an intermixing of traditions and heritages and also surprises that they have to kind of relate to. So Muhammad Shahrur, for example, to come to an example, has nothing to do with religion. And you're right, that is, he is a civil engineer. But he becomes a religious scholar in response to a crisis that he did not expect, which is the 1967 war, so to speak. And Islam has nothing to do with the 1967 war. But in fact, a lot of other intellectuals went to Islam and to study Islam after 1967 because they wanted to understand kind of the root cultural causes of the defeat. That was not a predictable kind of development, so to speak. So for me, life worlds kind of as a concept basically is useful not because it offers us any finality, but rather because it parallels life itself. Kind of because to the extent that we are not dead yet, that we are involved in processes of life, so to speak, and we don't control the environment that we inhabit, much less the world. If the whole thing of all these movements and the thought systems we are talking about are experimental in nature and are not final and they're not closed and they are capable of further transformation, we are thinking about something that is alive as well. And religion itself can be thought of that way. I thought, especially if I talk about religion as a living kind of sort of system, or a living kind of belief, right, in a modern world, right? It lives on to the extent that it provides life, or certain lives, with something that they feel they need. Right? So I am okay, actually, because of that, with lack of finality, because I think that is closer, right, to the truth of things than when we talk about kind of closed structures, right? Which we only have in a very limited sense in the world that we are inhabit. We are talking, in fact, about movements that are contesting the closed nature of the structures and of the systems that we have. Right? And also, we're talking about something that is ancient, right? Old ideas, right? That continue to be alive, right? And that is really the main question: why are they alive still? They're alive because there is a live world that is reproducing them on an ongoing basis until they die, but they have not died yet. Right? And so the concept of life worlds does indeed, right, show kind of the undetermined nature of things. It is open to the chaotic processes. It is open to surprise, and it gives us, I think, enough sense of what is happening. But I don't think it gives us kind of a final answer, and which we don't have in any case, so to speak. So that's, and I think that applies to secular movement as well, to the extent that secular movements, or kind of, if we want to use that term, are themselves continuing to evolve and are alive, in the sense. So life world, basically, in as it was used as terminology in modern philosophy, does not necessarily actually address only religious kind of phenomena, but rather it is kind of applies to any kind of social kind of belief system, and groupings that are that kind of do feel that they have something to contribute in a world that we live right now in this moment. So in that sense, that's why I think it is actually very kind of useful.
Hamad, we have, by the way, other two speakers. Other two questions. Okay. So just if you can go fast, okay, sure. That we get.
Okay. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Okay. So let me stop here, and we can.
Okay. So Rawan,
wrap up everything together.
Rawan Hamad from Istanbul.
Thank you, Dr.
Hello,
Safi.
Rawan.
Thank you to Dr. Mohammed and Dr. Louay. My question is actually related to political Islam movements. So prior to the Arab Uprisings, there was this traction to political Islam movements because they've been on the opposition side. They've been rallying behind a slogan of Islam as a solution and so on. And this has kind of like got them certain traction that they have lost significantly in the past 10 years, let's say, for various reasons, whether it's their failures in positions of power, or also like the narratives of counter-revolution and so on. So my question is, how do you see that reflecting on the use of Islam as a tool in social movements and political movements as well, and how do you see that reflecting in the long term on, let's say, Islam as a social movement in general?
Mm-hmm. Just take
okay. Fahad Ahmad. Fahad?
Yes, sir. I put my question in the chat, but I'll just repeat it. Firstly, I'd like to say congratulations on the book. It's very profound and thought-provoking read. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And my question is a bit philosophical in nature, and it was regarding the nature of the life world concept itself, which I think you've partially answered in the question you answered just a moment ago. So is the concept like this. You have a sea, and you can take a glass and hold the sea in a small body of water in your hands. It is simultaneously part of the sea and immediately independent of it. And is this what the life world discourse acknowledges? Mm-hmm. And if so, does it mean we will, by nature of the life world, be incapable of grasping completely the sea itself? That's all. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Doctor.
Okay, good.
Okay. Hamad, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting, very interesting. The question of power actually is being in power and then losing after that. I think this is a common narrative. In fact, that's something I do discuss. The record so far shows that often it is the case that when Islamic movements capture the stage or become part of it, they lose popularity. And you only need to look at the recent elections in Morocco, for example. But there were other kind of cases before that. And I think there is a reason for that. Being outside of power allows the movement to maintain an aura of ethical purity, to speak right. There is nothing that is expected if you are cultivating ethics and spirituality in society and good behaviors. When you are in power, you are expected to do what anyone in power does, which is take care of people, fix social problems, and so on. And if the state does not have the resources for that, or if you make a mistake, which I think is unavoidable, if you are in power, you are going to annoy somebody, so to speak, right? Then you are going to lose that aura of ethical a purity and aloofness, right? You become more earthly, basically, power, and become contaminated, so to speak, right? If you want to use that term. So wherever in Egypt, basically that was the case, in Tunisia, in Jordan, anywhere you have social movements, Islamic social movements that came to power, basically, they lost popularity, to speak right. And that may be actually the fate of any other party that comes to power. The problem is basically that the power exposes the ideas that tended to be discussed as a pure ideas into the profane, the world of politics, so to speak, right? And failure is part of that experience, that kind of experience, and they become like everyone else. So Christian social democracy in Europe, for example, is the same story. The Christian Social Democratic Party in Europe are political parties like any other party, and they're evaluated the same way as any other political party in the terms of their success or failure in solving social problems. When you become part of power, you become like everyone else who is in power, so to speak, and you are evaluated on the basis of the same criteria. Right? You lose that moral aloofness that you had before. You were part of the political equation. You become contaminated. Sudan, Algeria, likewise. I mean, after 2019, what we hear is that political Islam in those countries also suffered and was not part of those uprisings because it had become part of the old system. So that and Turkey as well. That is, Turkey is a more nuanced case because Erdogan's first 10 years, where in fact there was success in solving some social issues and political problems. The party did gain because it did seem to be managing well, but not after 2013. That's to be expected. The other thing about power that I think is important to keep in mind, especially when we think about the Arab Uprisings in particular, namely uprisings that were done in the name of the people, in the name of Shab, not in the name of Islam, but something, some entity that called the people, so to speak, and the people, as a concept, as we know, contains differences, so it is not a unified monolith. It includes lots of different interests, classes as well. Class analysis here becomes important. But if you have kind of popular revolutions in which kind of everyone participated, all social classes, and that diversity was called a shop, then actually the appropriate system after the revolution would be something that kind of corresponds to that consensus, to that kind of unity. And the problem, of course, after 2011 in the Arab Uprising is that we had party-based elections, so to speak. So basically, whomever was elected to office was not elected in the name of a shop, not in the name of the people, but rather in the name of a specific political party, including religious political parties. So during that phase, basically, religious parties that participated in election appeared as partial, not as representing that social consensus that we see in the revolution, but as representing just another political force. And we may be at the point when we are learning basically from the heritage, kind of that process, and how the question would be how to actually think of kind of post-revolutionary political systems that as being embodying some kind of social consensus. I don't think we have figured that out yet, because the model that was kind of attempted was based on parochial parties, which is okay if you actually have already established democracy, but we don't have that, right? Yet, at least. I was intrigued by the metaphor of the sea. That for me would be actually an example of the inductive method, not so much of a life world, although it may be close. I mean, I have to think about it. But basically, the question of how do you universalize on the basis of a particular experience, which was what we typically call the inductive method. And the one interesting thing about the inductive method is that it begins from not from the whole, but from actually an empirical experience as a way to approach the whole. It may be actually related to something that Dr. Louay mentioned earlier about the names of God, basically as kind of one way by which a certain property that we can have as a human, like the capacity for justice, for example, being also the property of God, so to speak. But his justice is kind of a lot more comprehensive and a lot more operates at a much higher level that we can comprehend, but we can sense kind of an element of it on the basis of kind of an experience that we can empirically have. I didn't think about the relationship between the particular and the universal as an expression of a life world necessarily, but could be seen, of course, in terms of how kind of induction basically as a mental process and also as a scientific method actually works. But I think it is really an interesting idea or metaphor as you propose.
Thank you so much, Hamad. We abuse your time, and so
thank you for the invitation.
It was a great event. Louay, would you like to say a few words in the end?
Yeah, I'm going to say one word about what Mohammed just mentioned about the life world. I think this is just in terms. I know the concept is so complex, and because it's complex, it is able to allow the thinker to go through the different facets of social interaction with more freedom. But really, at the core of that is this dialectical relation between the universal and the particular. And that's how humans are able to understand the evolution of anything, because it's a relationship between the idea as a universal concept and its manifestation in human expression. which is, as you know, this is the Hegelian dialectic. Although I'm not really invoking it as completely Hegelian dialectic, but this is one form of it. But at any rate, let me, in conclusion, say that I did really enjoy both reading your book and listening to you, and I have to be grateful to my friend Sari for inviting me to comment on this work. Of course, the title was attractive to me by itself, but I wasn't aware of your work before of that. But I feel like this was a good opportunity for me to see that you have been, you have been working for a long time on your ideas. That's very clear. I would look forward to read other books of yours, and maybe we'll have another occasion to have more exchange, because really I didn't really scratch the surface of what you have written, and that was really part of my challenge: how to reduce the amount of writing and analysis into some basic points that's suitable for this kind of engagement. But at any rate, this has been very, a good time for me. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you so much. So on behalf of KAMES, I would like to thank Mohammed Bamyeh and Louay Safi, and hopefully to see you in other occasion. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for
the generosity and the ideas.
Yeah.
See you soon.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.